Thank you everyone for joining us today, and got a little bit of overhearing a little of our extracurricular conversation there between Hilary and me. It is my pleasure to bring to you tonight a conversation between myself and Hilary. Hilary is with the NAACP here in Washington, D.C., has worked for many years with JACL in his capacity there, and we have really appreciated the relationship that we have built with him and many of our other partners here. I think that's one of the themes you're going to hear tonight about how it's not just the NAACP and JACL, but so many other partners as well that we all do work together here to try and achieve the goals that we do have set as far as advancing the civil rights of all Americans in the United States. So Hilary, why don't we go ahead and get started since we do have limited time, but I want to start out with maybe just having you talk a little bit about NAACP, about your history, particularly why was it founded? It preceded JACL by a few years and actually served as the model for JACL when we did found about, I think it was 20 years after NAACP did.
Oh, very good. First, David, it's a real honor to be with you today and to all those who have joined us, and of course, your fantastic staff. You know, JACL and the NAACP have been great friends for a long time. As a matter of fact, from thinking about issues around the March on Washington, thinking about some of the other important marches and some of the political issues we worked on together, from the Civil Rights Act to the Voting Rights Act to the Fair Housing Act, and the other issues very, very important to us. Let me say the NAACP was founded in many ways for the same reason JACL was. And that is, we saw that as much as we had a constitution that guaranteed us equal opportunity and equal protection under law, there's no question about what that constitution says. How it is utilized and how we enforce those laws have become a major concern and a deep challenge. We were founded in a small apartment in New York City in 1909, but was the follow-up to a couple of meetings that were held between two different organizations, one that was predominantly African-American and the other was predominantly white, but both organizations focusing in on the real opportunity for all Americans, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, point of national origin, sexual orientation, and other differences, but should be treated equally and fairly. So in essence, again, we were able to, as we would say in our communities, exit the bondages of slavery, but we were not able to enter the mainstream of society. And we saw every time there was a pushback or a fear anywhere, we ended up falling almost literally on the sides of those that just for no established reason had problems with the fact that African Americans, from our perspective, former slaves and otherwise, were considered full citizens of the country and would have the same rights as others. Well, there are many that disagree with that. And so in both, and as I mentioned, the African American communities, white American communities, but also Native American communities, Hispanic communities, Asian communities all saw it the same way. That all of us are supposed to be treated fairly, that this country promises us an equal opportunity for full participation, that we would be able to pursue a great life, a safe life for our kids, real opportunities for ourselves and our children to continue to move forward. So a small group of African American, white American men and women all came together and said, now's the time. We're going to issue a call for those to join us, to actually begin working to actually secure that right, that protection that was offered by our Constitution that was extended to all of us. If we were born here in the United States, if we have citizenship going through naturalization, or whatever the case might be, we should be able to fully participate. But every time we made a few steps forward, we realized the challenges were there. Again, as we look at the end of the Civil War in the 1860s, we moved through the Reconstruction era of the United States, as we saw that there were those Americans that were safely and securely under the control of, at that time, Abraham Lincoln and the US Congress. The move to separate the country, as we saw, what not had failed, and that very well the Civil War was won by the North, and all Americans would be able to participate. But that also included a few things that happened under Mr. Lincoln. Number one is Abraham Lincoln signed an executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. This was an order that actually said that slavery was illegal and would eliminate it altogether. Then the questions came up, well, if slavery is illegal, what of these that were stolen from the continent of Africa and brought to the United States, what are they then? And that's when the Constitution was amended 3 times by, interestingly enough, a Republican Congress. It was a Republican Congress. As we know, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican as well. Then moved us to actually pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, equal protection, equal opportunity. It moved then to the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that set our citizenship in place and made it clear that all those born in the United States and those of former servitude would be considered full citizens of the United States very clearly. And then finally, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution that also spoke very specifically to the rights of citizenship. And that is, the 15th Amendment said that there will be no obstacles, no other intrusions in all Americans, including those of former servitude, being able to cast an unfettered vote and have it counted. But we learned some tough lessons as our country went through a number of struggles, whether it's because of Andrew Johnson that cut deals to allow the pull federal troops out of the South and allow those Southern governors and others to control again, that end up striking out against people of color across the board. This was something that was not only experienced by those of former servitude, African Americans, but many others as they made their way into the South to want to participate, or even those that were already there. David, there's a fascinating saying about those Americans that were very much a part of that. And that is that we always say that we see the people migrating into what we call the United States. Well, we very well know that most of those that we saw out in the West that appeared Hispanic actually were, in that they were the descendants of Mexico, but they were the descendants of Mexico before they moved the border and actually moved the United States border over what was Mexican territory and whatnot. The people stayed, but the border changed, the citizenship changed, and other things changed. Well, we knew we had a number of fights along the way that we were going to have to take on, whether it was the issues around the Black codes, laws that were very clearly laid out to differentiate between people of color, African Americans very specifically, and white Americans, whether it was Jim Crow, another set of tools that was utilized to actually marginalize racial and ethnic minorities while promoting white Americans unfairly and not allowing full participation of all in our society. So we went through quite a few changes there. And that's when we realized that those were wonderful words in the Constitution, and our Constitution is our most powerful governing document. But those words would need tools and strategies for enforcement. And that's why we saw laws being passed actually to support the Constitution of the United States. And that's when we speak about some of the basic issues of, again, of citizenship for all. As we think about something as important as voting, we know there probably is no more important thing that Americans have than the right to vote. It speaks very specifically to our democracy itself. And in essence, in the United States, we hold our democracy up as being crucially important to all that we are and all that we do, that our values and voices could be heard in a way that we would understand that this is simply part of being an American. This is what the Constitution and the Bill of Rights promotes and promises. This is why we have to continue to work to make it real for everyone, because there are some.
And one of the things we were talking about is kind of how history has continued to repeat itself over and over as far as the patterns of oppression, and whether we go back to the genocide of Native Americans, slavery, followed by Chinese exclusion acts, Japanese American incarceration, and now several of the anti-immigrant policies that we see today, that it's the exclusion. And I think where that also goes to, though, is where you're starting to go now, talking about voting, for example, where there are certain areas where they have been leveraged in a way to oppress communities, particularly the African American community. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how voting has, and which led to the Voting Rights Act, of course, but how voting was weaponized against the African American community historically, and now what are we trying to do to combat some of those problems that we've had throughout history.
David, you're absolutely right. When we think about what occurred during those times, a lot of questions immediately come to mind. We're thinking about southern states like Mississippi. At the time that Mississippi finally met the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act of '64 and then on, it's because Mississippi has somehow become a state with about 45% of its population being African American, but not able to elect even one African American to the US Congress statewide, whether it's, if you're thinking about the governor's mansion and the state legislatures, but also, of course, in Washington, D.C., when we think about those who are elected to advance the position and the values of those in the state of Mississippi. The same thing was true of Alabama and North and South Carolina, even Florida and Virginia. You had states that were very heavily racial and ethnic minority during those years, most specifically heavily African American. But for one reason or another, because of gerrymandering, because of the fraudulent behavior and other things, we saw that we were locked out of the process. If our votes were not allowed to be cast, if our votes were not counted or unfairly counted, if other tools of gerrymandering were to break up the opportunity for all Americans, African American and otherwise, to vote for those that represented their values as we think about the issues that are voted on here in Congress, both House and Senate, or even as we think about electing who would be our president, our voices were very clearly locked out. Those same issues apply to other communities as well, because let me just say that we may have been the largest racial and ethnic minority during that time, but these practices that were actually honed by going after us the way that they did were utilized to go after the Asian American community, Native American communities in many levels and areas, the Latinx community, and even other differences within our society. So those tools were utilized to lock us out, though our democracy will tell you that within our federalist system, that this is the way that we actually move in our democracy to elect people that would then vote on that regular daily basis. Again, whether we're talking about in Washington, House and Senate, or who is sent to the White House, or whether we're thinking about what happens at the state level. Federalism also means that at the state level, more decisions and more power is held than at the federal level. The federal government can leverage its power or speak very specifically to where somebody has actually worked against the Constitution itself. But the federal level cannot control time, place, or manner of elections. That's something that's done by the state level. It cannot control other things that are very specific to our communities along those lines as well. And that's why I believe the NAACP has always worked to organize ourselves at those three levels. I work for the national organization in the Government Affairs Office in DC. My job is to advocate the NAACP's policy agenda as it comes over, as we advocate for it here in Washington. We have state level, that is, we have what we call state conferences of branches, work much the same way. They said their focus will always be on state laws, state process and procedures. They're talking to governors and state members of houses and Senate. Sometimes other names are utilized, but along those lines. And then finally, we have about 2,200 membership units. That includes about 1,700 local branches in cities and towns. There's a DC branch of the NAACP that's different from what I do for the national organization. But we go all over the country. We see that in every single state, usually wherever the largest populations are, in some cases, smaller populations as well, as we focus in on not only what's happening at the state level, then finally, those local branches at the local level, working with mayors and city councils and town councils, village councils, and otherwise, again, to see the work we do together realized as it's administered at the ground level. We have focused for a very long time, David, in making sure that we can speak truth to power, as the saying goes, at every level in which that power is being activated.
Now, one of the things, as we're talking about the right to vote, one segment of the population that has also been often taken away the right to vote is those who are incarcerated. And incarceration has been a weapon used against communities. And obviously, Japanese Americans, that's a big part of our story, the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. But I think that's a tool that has been used as well against the African American community as well for many years now.
Absolutely. David, let me say that the first places we've seen where the disenfranchisement of felony offenders should be applied was actually Mississippi. Indeed, what the state did is gave the local law enforcement officials the authority to arrest, convict even for non-violent local offenses. Nothing serious as you would think, but serious enough to take one's vote away, but nonetheless a tool that was utilized to control for who would be arrested, who would be convicted, even returned home the next day, but in the process, their right to vote was stripped away. As we look at that data even now, we've seen it grow from Mississippi to Alabama and on to North and South Carolina and on throughout the country. Some states still decided they would not take your right to vote away if you were convicted of a felony offense. Let me say it is fascinating, and I hope that I'm not sounding too paranoid when I say it like this, but there are the states that seem to have the smallest racial and ethnic minority population are also the states that leave that power to vote to those even in our prison cells. As an example, I think you probably know Patrick Leahy from Vermont. Pat Leahy has served as chair of the Judiciary Committee for years, other positions, and has always been very friendly to our policy agenda, is both championed and supported what we've tried to get done on Capitol Hill. David, when we introduced our first bill to really begin addressing the issue of the disenfranchisement of felony offenders, we sat down with, on the House side, John Conyers from Michigan, as a matter of fact. And on the Senate side, we sat down with Russell Feingold from Wisconsin at the time. And what we said to each of them is, look, we're looking at the country and we're seeing some differences in how people go about this. And they sat with us and we crafted legislation. And as we prepared to introduce it, I wanted to get Pat Leahy on board as he's the chair of the Judiciary Committee at the time. Stopped by his office to see him. I came in, he said, I know we have a plan to talk, but can we walk and talk? We've been knowing each other for a while. And he had a vote that had just been summoned, and we were walking across the Capitol grounds. And so he said, Hillary, tell me what's going on. And I said, well, Senator, you probably know we have over 5 million Americans that can't vote today because they have felony offenses on their record. And over 30% of those are African Americans, who are only 12% of the population. We want to change the law. And he started laughing. I didn't understand that because he's always such a nice guy, very sensitive and thoughtful. And he said, please excuse me for laughing. He said, Hillary, I'm from Vermont. He said, you can vote from your jail cell in Vermont if you're an axe murderer. In other words, the people of the state of Vermont decided that that was not appropriate. If you're in jail for having committed a crime, you still should have the opportunity to cast your votes. And indeed, the last thing he said that I had to chuckle behind as well, he said, I go into the jails at least every 6 years to try to get their support. Think about how different the world would be as we know it if every member of Congress that was voting on whether to disenfranchise someone or not knew that at the end of somewhere in the 2 years, if you're a House member, and somewhere in that years, if you're a U.S. Senate, those same people that you strip their rights and protections and opportunities away from will be those that would also help decide whether you get to stay in Congress or go back home. So in essence, we knew then that it was the right way to go, but the challenge continued to be there. We've always had support from some. Interestingly enough, more Democrats, for some reason or the others, always supported us in the reenfranchisement efforts, but much fewer Republicans at this point. Our hope is that we can change their minds, their hearts, and of course their votes. We move these bills to the floor to have them voted on as well. So we've a lot along those lines. We'll continue to have that fight. Last point I want to leave this to is that this is also where our folks at the state level come in very handy. The real power to decide whether one can vote or not after having committed a felony offense. It's going to happen at the state level.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we push hard to make sure our members are equipped with sample legislation, talking points, and other things, even statistical information and background data. We have a saying at the NAACP is we're looking at any of these problems. In order to manage them, you've got to first measure them. So being able to keep track of that data continues to be important, because let me also say this, as we're having this conversation here and across the country, we still know that there are those that couldn't vote before, but their right to vote is being restored. I think some states are changing their minds.
Mhm.
People on the ground are saying to the elected officials, everyone should be able to vote. For thinking about what happens after one completes their time in prison, one of the things that's been very clear, that those who believe they have something at stake back home, for those who believe they'll have a real opportunity even after paying that debt to society, or able to go back, they know they're going to be able to cast their votes. If you're casting votes, it shows that you have a real handle on ownership. You believe in the country, you believe in the process of making the decisions, and you believe in making sure your voice is heard and your votes are cast. So in essence, it's been taking a little while as we get into these issues. It still needs to change. We know those first disenfranchisement laws were put in place to control people in those areas. That if you can, even if there are more African Americans or Asian Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics, or others living in an area, if you can chisel away at their opportunity, the power they have to cast their votes and have their positions heard, then indeed you can control unfairly what happens in that place, in those areas, in the states.
I think, and we see what's happening in Florida, where they actually did pass legislation, and now we see the same, essentially a poll tax being put in to prevent the re-enfranchisement of people who, through the voice of the people, actually were given the right to vote again.
Absolutely. David, if I can add to that, you mentioned poll taxes and how these things come back around, and you're absolutely right. You've been in some of those meetings with us with Eric Holder and others as the Attorney General of the United States, we were trying to get a few things done. So you know that before the Shelby versus Holder decision was passed, Shelby versus Holder, of course, was a decision in which states would be able to argue that that they should have control over the entire voting process regardless. Even before the decision was adjudicated before the federal courts, we know there were those that were trying to make changes to lock us out and prevent us from being able to fully participate. In essence, what was happening is they were saying at that particular time, you have to have a photo ID specially issued by the state government to be able to cast that unfettered vote and have that vote counted. So in essence, as we looked at what that meant, we realized that as we think about the African Americans and some other groups, we are among the poorest of the poor. We're much less likely to have the kind of resources to take care of families and buy something like a car. And as such, we're less likely to have a driver's license, which is probably the most universally accepted form of photo ID you can utilize across the country as you move in to vote. But as that decision was being considered from states that had an awful track record of discrimination, that were covered then by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Section 5, of course, the provision that says, you've proven that you're not going to be fair. You've proven that you'll craft policies and procedures that will discriminate against someone simply because of their race, their ethnicity, their point of national origin. We know how you've been playing that game. So in essence, as Eric Holder said so insightfully, he said, look, he said the Civil Rights Act the Voting Rights Act was passed because we knew we had those that would actually trick people out of their vote. Those that would move polling sites without letting you know, those that put in place photo ID provisions and whatnot, and not tell you that you'll have to spend an extra $50 or so to be able to have this ID just to be able to vote. Much the way you use that term, David, showing how brilliant you are on these issues. Holder said much the same thing. He said, look, a poll tax by any other name is still a poll tax. So whether you pay for it in advance by having to buy that photo ID, even though we know people that are out there trying to vote and whatnot, we know that there's no pattern of people pretending to be someone that they're not so they can go to the polls and cast a vote.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not the case. You and I both remember what happened even in the state of Kansas. As Sam Brownback was the governor, he signed into law a photo ID bill and said, and now we can restore trust and integrity to the voting process because no one will be able to cast a vote pretending to be someone else. So we started digging. We started digging to see how often someone was pretending to be someone else when they went to the polls to cast that vote. You know how many cases of voter fraud along those lines of someone pretending to be someone else they were able to find over a 20-year period? 2. And they got caught. 2.
Yep.
The old system allowing everyone to cast that unfettered vote and have it counted. So we understood the trickery that was going on and for no good reason. We also understood those who would be discriminated against and left out of the process. Mm-hmm. Think about, for instance, North Carolina for a minute. We looked at what was going on in North Carolina as before the Obama election. And what we found is that in North Carolina, prior to the Obama election, Obama won by about 640,000 votes in the state of North Carolina the first time around. What we also learned is that if we looked at all those Americans that were able to cast that vote, that very many of those were people of color. They were able to vote because there weren't obstacles to their participation. But when we looked at the data and saw how many of those people would be taken out of play if they didn't have a photo ID card and whatnot, of those numbers that he was able to win by, he would have lost by about 100,000 votes, not because people didn't want to support him. He would have lost because they would have been prohibited from being able to cast their votes on the election.
Yeah, I think what's interesting when we talk about, particularly with voter ID and things like that, and it's almost ironic because we have this system where elections are so localized that I go down to my polling place and all the ladies there know who I am, and then you walk in and everybody knows your name. You don't need an ID almost in many cases.
Well, it's the same way. I live here in Southwest DC.
Yeah.
Anything applies. I see the same poll workers that I see bump into in the grocery store. I don't think it's poll workers. I just see them in the grocery store. Yeah. If I see walking down the street, my local cleaning store, or whatever the case might be, whoever they are, I will see them there. And when I go to my little junior high school around the corner, I'll recognize half of them as they're doing other things, passing flyers and get everybody ready to go vote. And when I go in, the same thing applies. Yeah. So in essence, we know we have a system that works. And for us here, we do something that, if we want to use a large term, we do signature attestation. Mm-hmm. All that means that when we go in, we've registered our names and our signatures are on a line in the ballot book. We sign again next to our address and everything else. They know we're there. We go in, we cast a vote, and it takes less time. There's less opportunity for discrimination. Because the last thing I think is important for people to also know and remember is that most voter fraud is not because someone is outside pretending to be someone they're not. Most voter fraud is conducted or concocted by the local governments that are controlling the polling process and the voting process itself.
Yeah, now you mentioned that you're in Southwest DC. I live in Northwest DC. I think we'd be remiss as DC residents if we did not mention the other great travesty of voting rights in this country.
Oh, you are so right. We've needed that for a long time. Let me say that for those who may not be as aware, we have more voting parent people living in Washington, D.C. than about 5 other states that do have the right to vote, giving them 2 senators, 1 voting House member. We have a delegate, much like other territories of the United States, and she cannot vote on the floor of the House when those issues roll around. And we have no senators, and that is sad as well. So that means there truly is not representation of the people of Washington, D.C., and we're seeing our population grow. David, as you know, I think we just surpassed the 800,000 mark for a city. And for anybody that wants to go online and say what states have over 800,000 people, you'll see it's going to leave some behind. Mm-hmm. More taxes than any of those other states, that fall into anything close to our category and whatnot. So it's a huge deal. People of DC deserve a vote. They deserve someone that can actually take their values with them to the floor of the House, the floor of the Senate, not to mention all the committees and otherwise, and make sure the real concerns of the people of DC are heard as well as any other state in our country.
Now, we've been talking a lot about electoral power. The other form of power in this country is obviously economics. And that's another area where, again, there are the tools that are used against our communities and also the tools that we can use to lift up our communities. I think workforce is a big one where we've been you and I are talking about how labor has been used. Basically, that's how many of our communities came to this country, and whether it was brought in chains as slaves or as cheap labor to build the railroads. Initially, the Chinese were brought here to that. Once the Exclusion Act came in, actually Japanese were brought in to work on the railroads and also plantations and things. So maybe I know we were talking yesterday much about the labor movement, how that changed over the years from one that was very exclusionary to one that is now probably the most inclusionary as far as including our communities.
I totally agree. And you're absolutely right. Listen, as we think about what was occurring then, yet again, the tools of segregation were utilized to lock people of color out. Again, whether they're black, brown, red, white, or red or otherwise, they were locked out of the system. When the labor movement came in, it recognized first that there were a number of incoming European immigrants that were also being locked out. They're being prevented from being able to fully participate. Let's say the group of Italians decided to take over a certain industry and they didn't want the Irish to come into those areas. You know, as the saying sometimes went outside of restaurants and bars, no dogs, no Irish, no African Americans, no Asian Americans. I mean, they oftentimes put that stuff on the front door saying, you guys can buy from us, but come around to the back door. We'll take your money, but you can't sit down inside and fully participate.
Of course, they weren't always that polite in how they'd say it. They'd usually use some other words to describe us.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, and it gave me one of those looks like, now you know better than that. You know you're not supposed to come to the front door. Y'all kind of folks are supposed to come to the back door. And if we were trying to buy a pair of shoes, don't think I'm going to let you try it on before I let you buy it. You're going to have to eyeball it and decide what you want, because I'm not giving your money back if you try to return it. I mean, those kind of issues were very much a part of the lay of the land, the discrimination that was going on, but that also gave people unfair opportunity to take advantage of people of color, whether we were buying a home, which of course is also an investment in wealth, of whether we're trying to sign up to go to school, or very well, whether we're simply trying to buy things and whatnot to take care of our families and so forth. So in other words, it didn't matter as long as they could profit off of it. If you look at all the evils that are done to our communities, of people of color, the commonality is somebody made a profit during that process off of our suffering. Someone was able to force us to work for fewer dollars on the hour than anyone else. We were not getting a fair day's wage for a hard day's work. But we know there were others that were able to utilize the protections of government to do all of those things. We were locked out. We were trying to find a way to fully and freely participate and fairly participate. But once again, we were not given the opportunity to fully participate in everything going on in our society. So those issues were huge. We have to fight those issues by also working together to pass laws to provide employment protection. We have to work together to provide to pass laws to provide for protection as we were buying homes, so we wouldn't be discriminated against. We could live in any community we could afford to live in with our dollars and cents, and you could not lock us out because of the color of our skin, the shape of our noses, or the texture of our hair. And those were the kind of issues that were too often utilized, and those were the issues that we were pushed aside. If someone else was found to be guilty of taking our money, they usually got to keep it. So if it was about property, they usually got to keep it. If it was about other things, businesses and the like, they usually did not have to give it back, and that was sad. In fact, that was as un-American as it gets. So we've had a hard job of it, but I think we recognize that in essence, determining whether something is right or wrong first is important, but also moving to determine what we can do to fairly repair this damage, and ensure that all Americans, regardless of how we look, are going to be treated fairly and given that constitutional guarantee of equal protection and equal opportunity.
Now, I think that, and one of the other aspects of a lot of the sort of economic system that we do have is, and also education you had mentioned earlier as well, is that oftentimes our communities are also pitted against one another. I think we've seen that as the challenge in, and right now we have the Yale case, for example, with the Department of Justice going after Yale for their admissions policies. Affirmative action, obviously, has always been a contentious point for many in our, particularly in the Asian American community. Similarly, economic development. Who owns the capital in a community? Who owns the stores? As we were talking yesterday, like my own grandparents who owned a Chinese carryout restaurant on the south side of Chicago. And we also have those tensions too in our communities because of who does get to build, who has access to the capital to establish those businesses.
All those things play a major role, and we share that in common. You mentioned your folks having the shop in town and whatnot that help pay for the family bills and whatnot and provide an American opportunity for all. My grandparents on my father's side owned a country store in Mississippi, and very much the same way. They were there trying to make a living for their 11 children. I have 6 brothers and sisters, and that's true, but that's about half the size of my daddy's family. One more than my mother's family. But with all that in mind, going into business has always been a big part of trying to make it in this country. We celebrate the small business people most of the time. Sometimes we see that there are those that work against them in a big way. So we know that race plays a role, but you cannot, in my opinion, significantly have that race conversation without what you've begun now, and that's that economic conversation. Economic conversation of following the money trail. Who's really benefiting from the scenario that locks us into one community and prohibits us from going into another? Those are about some of the historic issues around Oklahoma and the like. We know about that Oklahoma riot in which the real target was the brand new African-American owned grocery store on the African-American side of town. And the white grocery store owner on the white side of town, and I use these examples because this was the real type of racial segregation we were living under. You could not live in certain sections of town if you weren't certain particular races or ethnicities. So with that in mind, we saw what happened there, and we saw an entire side of town get burned down, and we saw even that Black grocery store owner killed in his own store because someone did not want to compete fairly with them in it. And at that time, what they created a quite segregated township and the like. So with all that in mind, the resources are always there. It's always good to count the money. So, I mean, even as we look at things like the unemployment rate in our country, it is rare these days, though we saw an improvement and increase when Barack Obama was in the White House, but it's rare these days that we actually disaggregate the unemployment data. David, let me put it this way. If we start looking at who has the jobs, and we can't stop there, but it's the beginning of this conversation. We start looking at who has the jobs, well, we'll see when those unemployment data, that unemployment data is released monthly, we'll see that it is an educated guess to say that there will be some disparities of the unemployed among racial and ethnic minorities in this country. I can tell you very specifically, as we're thinking about the African-American community on any given day, even as Donald Trump was actually bragging about the lowest unemployment rate in the history of the United States since that data was collected. He didn't disaggregate to see that even as much as we were looking at 3% overall, which is great for the entire country, when we started disaggregating by race and ethnicity, what we started seeing is something much more insidious. And that is the African American community, as much as it was 3% for everyone, it was over 7% for us. When we looked at others, we saw those disparities very much there as well. So we knew that as the game was being played, they were not being totally honest and transparent about it. But we also know that when we're focusing on all the issues, when we're looking at who's at play and how it works, that we can very well do well if that data is collected, because again, that's a problem that needs to be solved. If we're going to solve that problem, we must first analyze the data and make sure we're assessing it all along. We want data-driven solutions, and it's probably more apparent challenge and problem we have in this country that we want to apply those same kind of solutions than employment in the United States.
Yeah, and I think particularly in these past few months with COVID, I mean, I think that has revealed so much about the disparities, particularly in the labor market. I mean, we talk about who is an essential worker. We talk about employees who oftentimes are not necessarily paid an essential wage. We are talking about minority communities, and for example, Filipino nurses, for example, who are disparately impacted by these requirements of who is expected to work in this pandemic, and who perhaps can stay home and work from the comfort of their house and not perhaps be as exposed. And I think we're seeing how our communities are being impacted so much more powerfully by these disparities.
You're absolutely right. As we're thinking about essential workers, as you say, and I agree with that term, whether it's the folks working in our grocery stores that are able to help sell us the groceries, get us through safely and get us out so we have something to take home to our families, whether we're talking about our restaurants. We know that those are some of the first positions to be set aside. A good example is restaurants. As you know, many that work in restaurants, serving tables and the like, again, being essential in bringing food to us, are also those that are more likely to be on tip wages. Mm-hmm. Tip wages mean that the foundation, of course, of the wage is usually below the minimum wage. You're usually looking at somewhere around $3.50 to $4 an hour.
Or even less.
Or less, absolutely.
My wife used to work as a waitress.
So you know, as you're assuming that you're going to make up that difference with those tips, if you're not serving tables, you're not getting tips. You're not even working. So in essence, as we think about those essential workers, we got locked out in a significant way, whether it was people, folks like your wife or people I know as well, that worked their way through college. As a matter of fact, waiting tables and working other tip labor positions. So again, as we look at the data, we're seeing that that's one of the major components as we move to raise the minimum wage. I believe most of our organizations are supporting at least a $15 an hour raise and somewhat more. As a matter of fact, the number of states have jumped ahead, and God bless them for being able to take it on themselves, because the federal government was not going to set it up in a way in which it was fair and balanced. As a matter of fact, if I looked at a list of states and the minimum wage, and what I saw was there were many states that just set their minimum wage by the federal government. In other words, if the federal government raises the minimum wage, so do they. If the federal government leaves it locked as it is now, where someone can make $7.50 an hour, but we also find, we look at how far that goes to take care of a family. If one person in the family of three is doing that, they're still making $3,000 below the poverty line. What an awful comparison to have to make. We should be able to do much better than that. It is an international embarrassment, and it's a national shame, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think when people are talking about it's, you make more money by being on unemployment than being employed, I think that tells you something about the wages that someone's being paid when they're being employed. And obviously that's not enough.
No, David, you're right. And the fact that they would argue that somehow or another, because we're doing the right thing by increasing the unemployment payment out, the PPP, paying that out in a way in which people are actually able to take care of their families and not find themselves in poverty, that there's somehow something wrong in that. And the members of the U.S. Senate, and I can't think of any member of the Senate that's not at least a millionaire right now, but members of the U.S. Senate would stand up and say, I've got to oppose this $6 an hour increase because it's paying better than unemployment insurance in my state. I was going to add a word to that, but I'll leave it alone because some people listen to this and I don't want to know me quite that way. But you point, you know. So we have to make sure we're watching out for those numbers, for those policies and processes. We have to make sure that everyone is treated fairly and humanely. It is saddening to me that as we look at countries across the world, we see that of all those industrialized nations, as we call ourselves, we're not doing the best. We should look at what some of the other countries are doing in many of these areas, including fair wages, education. You know, as we're thinking about things like the cost of college in the United States. So when I was in Germany, the NAACP has units, as I mentioned, on military bases, and one of our oldest is in Heidelberg, Germany. I went there to give a Dr. King birthday speech, and they took me to the university. This is considered one of the oldest and finest universities in the world. And there I met an African-American woman from California. And I asked, what were you doing studying in Germany? And she said, well, I'm working on my PhD. They gave me an opportunity to come here to go to school and whatnot. I said, well, why Germany? Are you studying German culture? I mean, why here? They said, no, it's not that. I said, it's just that coming here to study means I don't pay tuition. Mm-hmm. I'm getting a full doctorate degree, not because they gave me scholarship money to do it, but because anybody that comes here to go to school is going to get money to do it. That's just a difference in how things are handled. Mm-hmm. So I have a problem that somehow or another, money seems to lead the way when we talk about the forms of discrimination our communities experience, the lack of opportunity our communities find ourselves suffering, and other issues along those lines. We want to make sure, as we're thinking about what's best for the American people, we should be the best. Mm-hmm. It means we still have some work to do on the policies that we utilize to determine how we do things in the United States.
Yeah, no, I think about, we have two fellows that work in the JCL office, you know, and when I hear about the student loans that they have had to take out, it's just unbelievable. I think for those who are my age and your age, and we didn't have to take out student loans as much as what they are now expected to take out. Yes, I had a lot of student debt, but it's magnitudes more what students are expected to have now. And people talk about the younger generation not really valuing things, but it's hard to value things when you're saddled with $250,000 in student loans.
Well, you're absolutely right. Let me say this in all honesty and transparency. Brother, my hair is about as white as it is now when I finish paying off my student loan. It's an awful position to be in, and we can do better. I think there's some that are of my generation that remember when states like California, if you were born in California, you go to one of those great, you know, high quality California schools for next to nothing.
Yeah.
You usually spend more money paying for books than you did on tuition. Yeah. And how folks like me, I'm from the show me state of Missouri, wish there was some way I could get California residency.
I think everybody thinks that when they're applying to school.
Absolutely.
I have thoughts run through my mind as well. I think, and we started off this conversation talking about history, about how it oftentimes repeats itself. And I think that the challenge with history is that so many of us don't really see it. That particularly for those of us not in the African American community, we don't really see what the African American community has had to deal with. And I think that all changed a couple months ago with George Floyd. That 9-minute video really showed this is what it means to be an African American man when you're dealing with the police. How do you see that as perhaps an inflection point, and what can we do to go forward and to perhaps change some of these systematic problems that we do have?
Well, let me just say it. What you're saying is right on target. And I think it's helpful for people to be reminded that what happened with George Floyd has happened before. And sadly, we didn't move because I think we saw it more as an anomaly than the pattern and practice of problems that we know it to be now. And some of us, as we watched that, remembered King, I'm not talking about Martin Luther King, we're talking about
Rodney, yeah.
exactly in California, being apparently they were trying to beat him to death. As the police officers swarmed him, clearly he was unarmed. They were able to get him out of the car onto the ground and beat him in an extraordinarily violent and raw way.
We can say it was an attempted lynching.
It absolutely, it was a modern day lynching without question. If you'd taken off those police uniforms and put on those white robes, you could not have told the difference. But in essence, as we watched what was going on there, everyone else saw it as well. It was an extraordinary time. David, it was a time in which most Americans believed that if you lived on one side of town, he was officer friendly. But on the other side of town, he was part of an invading force. So in essence, the hard lesson we learned is that we have some wonderful police officers. They put their lives on the line. They risk their health and their very lives for their communities. And of course, they're always jeopardizing the possibilities of their family, losing someone extraordinary along those lines. But we saw happening in that case is when Americans, regardless of race, gender, or ethnicity, point of national origin, or other differences, saw what was going on, it shattered in many ways those that had lived on the side of town in which the police officers were much more responsive. It shattered their vision. They were able to see that indeed it was a bigger problem than they realized. As they moved throughout, I use that as an example because that was probably the first time, I think, on national television, we saw what could happen. It was the first time, as a matter of fact, it's amazing how even that worked. A white man had just bought a brand new, believe it or not, 8mm video camera. It's one of those that had sound attached to it, but it was one of those that was not digital as we know things now. You actually used a form of film in it, and you actually had to develop that film to be able to watch what you were seeing. In that particular case, he was standing out on his balcony with that camera. He saw this police chase end up right across the street from his apartment. He began filming the whole thing and then turned it over to a local TV station. People saw what was going on and were outraged. As we moved throughout and saw the improvement in the technology and moved from just a video camera, 8mm along those lines, to, of course, these extraordinary video cameras we have in our cell phones, we're seeing more and more that it's not an anomaly. It's not something that happens. It is indeed a pattern and a practice in too many areas. And the tough lessons we've learned is that we've seen that kind of violence turned on African Americans, but we've seen it turned on other Americans as well. And it's sad that we're living through that. And for some reason or another, and I'm still trying to figure this one out, the control of the police departments, what they utilize from chokeholds to other ways of holding people down, and in this case, even summarily executing them on one of our streets by putting their arms around their neck and choking. And when that person dies, they don't say, oops, a police officer made a mistake. They actually say the reason that person died was because those Black folks' necks are just made differently. And as such, when we put this hold on them, they die. But they don't tell you that they don't put it on other people that same way. What we saw happen with George Floyd is the move then was to shackle his hands behind his back, but then lay into his neck with their knee until it cut off both blood and oxygen, able to go in. And even during that time, he was able to muster up enough to say, I can't breathe. And then we were taken back to Eric Garner in New York. Remember what happened in his case, not a violent crime. They were worried about protecting not the fear of being attacked by someone, but they were actually going after him because someone told he was selling loose cigarettes. Now I'm trying to remember at any time in our society, any state, local, or federal law that somehow made selling loose cigarettes a
capital punishment.
Capital punishment disease issue and whatnot. So you're absolutely right. So much needs to be done, but we're seeing with video cameras on phones and otherwise what's going on, and the American people are outraged. The lessons for folks like us that advocate the way that we do at JACL, NAACP, is that if we're able to make sure we show people how that works. We began pushing for things like body cams for police officers on our streets because we want to capture all of that. And of course, we saw the ridiculousness of those local lawmakers say, well, yeah, if the federal government's willing to give us free video cameras, we'll take it. Said, but when you have to turn it off or not, figure out how that's going to work. Whether or not you have to have it pointing in a certain direction, being on all the time, or how long. You actually have to keep the video footage that was recorded, who has access to it, and other issues along those lines that will make for good policy, make for good law, and are actually the kind of things we've been fighting for, not only on Capitol Hill, but in state legislatures all over the country. So we're seeing how those things are played out, and we have to be consistent as we have. And again, I thank JACL for its consistent and continuous work to address these kind of issues to achieve fairness.
What do you see as the way forward? Obviously, in the House, they just passed the Justice and Policing Act. We actually do have a question about defunding the police, and how is that a part of the solution as well? And it's now in the Senate's sort of black hole, but
graveyard or whatever we call it. Sure.
What do you see as our prospects for achieving some realistic and tangible reform?
Well, it will all start with the activism of membership-based organizations like ours, making sure that they are educated on the issues and the options for solutions. Make sure our folks are talking to their members of Congress, House and Senate, and writing their president as well, to let them know where we stand on these issues, how important it is for us, that we very well have laws in place that are going to protect the American people in a fair and equal way as well. And if we're getting all those things and whatnot and moving in the right direction, I believe we can begin winning more. For some reason, as we look at it, people wonder, well, why should I stick my neck out and raise concerns about policing if they're going to get off and me and my family might get targeted by those that support that police officer being able to get away with what they're doing. So our big push has to be to organize our people, the members of our organizations of various races and ethnicities they belong to, work in coalition as we do, craft solutions that also recognize the problem very loudly and very clearly, and work to make sure all those issues are put in place. I've seen what happens when a member of Congress, regardless of their political party affiliation, sees that their voters in their district or their state are going to hold them accountable. That in essence, if you don't support this Make Sense bill, they'll provide better protections and, quite frankly, more effective policing in my community, then we may have to send somebody else to the House, somebody else to the Senate, maybe somebody else to the White House itself. Being organized that way, knowing what they are, and as you do, I've been at JACL meetings, so I know how you guys work, the kind of information you bring for them to utilize, the kind of instructions you give them as they're going to Capitol Hill to visit with their legislators, and quite frankly, the kind of information and training and education you give them as they're going back home, recognizing that advocacy doesn't start and begin in Washington. Advocacy starts at home. It starts where we live. It starts with those votes we're able to take on election day, again, whether it's here at the federal government, at the state or local governments. We organize better that way. We're gonna have to work in coalition a little bit better as well, David. In essence, I believe we do an excellent job here in Washington. We work together to create and grow the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights that is the most effective civil rights coalition in our country, and some argue the most effective in the world for that matter. But in any which case, we recognize the value in working together in coalition. We may have experienced these problems a little bit differently. It may have come at one point or another that's different from the African-American community, but we all know it to be a problem. And if we can come together on solutions that make sure that these kind of attacks don't happen to any people of color, women, or anyone perceived as being different, and even our friends in the disabilities community get targeted for various reasons as well, that if we can work all that out together, we can win on these issues at home and throughout the country.
Now, a big part of why we wanted to do this tonight was to really emphasize the need for our community to better understand what the African American community has experienced. And I think that a lot of that goes back to, again, we're going back to history again,
Oh, yes,
but it
yes.
goes to our history with Japanese American redress and reparations. That as a result of what happened during World War II, we obviously achieved redress some 30 years ago. And that now is perhaps the model for potential African American redress. HR 40 is very much a parallel to the study commission that was created to look at Japanese American incarceration experience. And now we have this opportunity perhaps to do the same, to really look at some of the things that we've been talking tonight about that have really permeated our history. That slavery didn't end with the Civil War, that it took a different form. And that's really why it is so imperative that we do push for things like HR 40. Do you want to maybe talk a little about where you see that? And
Absolutely. And David, let me first say I thank the Japanese American communities for being so stalwart on that issue of redress. In essence, what was done to the Japanese American communities, families, and otherwise, as we went through a war with Japan, was absolutely not only unfair, it was downright evil. When you think about people being taken out of their homes because they happen to have been the descendants of another country. And you and I both know that in the United States of America, the only folks that aren't descendants of other countries are the Native Americans. And right now they make up just a tiny bit over 2% of the population. That means that over 90% of our population is from someplace else. But for some reason, because Japanese Americans who were working hard, building community, raising their families, starting businesses, if you took away their race or ethnicity and just talked about Americans doing that, we'd be celebrating and giving an award to every single Japanese American family in our country. But that's not what we experience. What we experience is something because they happen to be different. Let me just say that when we're in a war with Germany, this did not happen to the Germans. When we're in other wars, this did not happen there either. Even the wars we're involved in Vietnam and otherwise, we did not do that. As a matter of fact, we accepted people from those countries that wanted to find stability and gave them the real promise of America, allowing them to come here. But that's what happened there and what happened to our Japanese American friends and brothers and sisters. As we look at how we've thought about that in the African American, you were smart enough to say, we need a government supported process to allow us to do a full assessment of the damages that are done and the responsibility of government in those damages that we experience. And because of that, reports were done, research was had, hearings were put on across the country to hear what was going on from some of those survivors, researchers, experts in the area, so we could see how much damage was done, who was responsible, and that we could actually move to fix that problem by changing the law and other things to make things fit better. We have a very similar experience in the African American community, and we borrowed very heavily from you. When we saw what was happening with redress and talking to John Conyers and others in the US Congress, we said, the first thing we need is an official study. One that's done with the auspices of the federal government and other parts of our government actively involved, an assessment that will let us know just what happened, who was responsible, what the damage was done as we think about liabilities. We are a country that believes that people should be held responsible for their actions, including our government. So in essence, we moved in to craft the law. It's been years and years, so we've tried to move it forward and whatnot to pass it. The bill was introduced in the House and the Senate this time around. The U.S. House of Representatives held a very, very thoughtful hearing on that issue. And it's moving now for that bill to come from the House, and we're waiting for the Senate to do what it needs to do as well. But again, as you mentioned earlier, about so many pieces of legislation that are so important to our communities that we worked very hard to pass through the U.S. House of Representatives. And this is where we give a great deal of gratitude to Nancy Pelosi, our first and second woman Speaker of the House of Representatives for supporting these measures and helping us move them through. She voted for the redress bill. She's very supportive and a co-sponsor of H.R. 40. We know that our friends on the Senate side, unfortunately a minority, have introduced companion legislation to do the same thing. What it will do is create a commission. That commission will bring forward witnesses and researchers and otherwise historians to talk about what's going on, to share the research they've been able to gather, to let us hear from the witnesses that know of the challenges and problems we've had in our society so we can move to the next step, crafting a solution that will allow those Americans and those descendants of those Americans to be able to actually fully enjoy the promise of America that we'd all be able to enjoy together. So we're excited about where that's going. We know the bill's doing fine and getting through the House, but unfortunately, for anybody from Kentucky, I hope they'll recognize that one of their two senators is a very powerful man that's using that power in a very reckless and sometimes vindictive manner, where people of color find ourselves being victimized yet again. We were victimized when the damage was done and when we sought some fix, when we sought some repair to those damages, when we went to those who were elected into office, they're in those high-level positions, like the majority leader of the United States Senate. They turned their back on us and said, look, my people, and I've heard this directly from senators and House members, they will tell me, I've not heard of any problems like that from my people. And I'm trying to figure out who they call themselves listening to when they're not listening to millions of Americans from the African American community, the Asian American community, the Hispanic communities, and otherwise.
Yeah, or even worse when they refer to us as you people. I think that's.
Oh God!
I think we're a little bit past an hour now. We actually I don't see any questions right now. For those of you who are listening in, there is a Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your questions that you'd like to have Hilary or me address. So we welcome those. Hilary, I think one of the, you've mentioned it already about coalitions, and I think in getting anything achieved here, whether it's through the leadership conference, there's so many other coalitions that we're both parts of. How do we really work together, and how's that a part of the successes that we have also found, such as passing Japanese American Redress?
Absolutely. Look, Dave, I'll say about coalitions, when I watch how we were able to get things done, there are times when we're trying to pass something we know may damage one community more than the other, but the other communities recognize as well. Some great examples of that is there are times when we're trying to get bills through that we knew one of our easiest changes, as someone we know would at least listen and make an informed decision and let their vote follow that decision. Believe it or not, was John McCain from Arizona. I will never forget, as we were trying to get new hate crimes legislation through, sadly, another issue that we share in common. Too often, those hate mongers that would go after you because if you're African Americans, can go after you because of your Asian American skin. They go after you because of your Native American skin, your Hispanic skin. In other words, it's not about who you are on the inside, how hard you work, the degrees you were able to accomplish. It's about the color of your skin and our ability to utilize our power to hold you down so we can maximize ours. But as we're looking at some of those issues along those lines, we recognize that, for instance, the Native American community was actually better postured to convince John McCain to do the right thing. And as we talked about the problems with the hate crimes bill, they too are victimized by hate mongers, by extremists that will very well utilize their power to, again, suppress ours. Taking them in with us for those meetings proved to be helpful. When our friends from other communities were going in to visit, for example, with friends from the Congressional Black Caucus, we recognize also that we could sometimes get the CBC to focus on how these issues affect African Americans as well, and as such steer their vote over to get things done. You probably know the most powerful caucuses combined on Capitol Hill really is what we commonly refer to as the Tri-Caucus.
Tri-Caucus, yeah.
The Tri-Caucus, as you and I are working together outside the walls of Congress, trying to impress upon them the importance of doing it, they're our friends that are working inside. They are the Asian Pacific American Caucus. They are the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. They are the Congressional Black Caucus. And when we look at how they vote on our issues, the maximum of those vote for issues that are important to all of our communities. Look, we also do a report card to keep track of how members of Congress are voting on issues that we prioritize. Since 1914, as a matter of fact, long before my time, even as white as my hair is, NAACP was doing a report card on how they voted on civil rights issues, voting rights issues, economic equality issues, education issues, healthcare issues, all the issues and more that we know are important to our communities. But if I look at my report card, and I've had the real, I suppose, honor of passing that report card out at some of the JACL conferences and meetings and whatnot. And I noticed as people looked at it, they were like, but these are our issues too. When you're talking about increasing money for Pell Grants so that my parents' ability to pay my tuition is not superseded by the federal government having a program in which I don't have to pay the money back. I just have to go ahead and get the degree. When we know that those things work for all of our communities, we all work together to try to increase Pell Grant resources. When we look at issues like, we talked about student loans a little bit earlier, but we know that the terms of those student loans have been very detrimental to our communities, to our folks and whatnot. They made it easy to take out the loans, but really hard to pay them back. Mm-hmm. So your average job coming out of school and beginning to work, even if you don't count the amount of time to get that job before you start working, quite frankly, is significantly different. So in essence, we know those issues work for us if we're able to work together. If I have a better understanding when I'm thinking about racial profiling, as an example, I know that's important for my communities when I think about how they've been pulled over so often. But to hear from another, I think, coalition partner of ours, a good friend named Karen Narasaki, that shared with me some years ago, say, when I asked her, would the Asian American community be interested in supporting a piece of legislation like this? And basically her response was, what took you so long? If you think about the experience we have, we can go right outside of DC to Prince George's County, a significant Asian American community living there as well, with the assumption that every time a group of Asian American young men are riding around in the car, they're probably members of a Chinese tongue, even if they happen to be Korean, even if they happen to be Vietnamese, even if they happen to be Japanese American. But those are the experiences that we end up having. We see how similar they are. So working in coalition also means that when I have a question that I think may work its way over into issues of the Asian American community, I can call my friend David Inoue. I can ask him what he thinks about it and what this means to his communities as I talk about what it means to ours. And we're able to work it out and get it done and make things better for everyone. Mm-hmm. Coalitions are the key to success. We want to make sure that we're talking there, but we also want to share our cultures, which is something I also strongly appreciate. Come together to talk about what's in the best interests of our communities, but let's share what's wonderful about each of our communities, whether it's the food, the dance, whether it's the history, the other examples, even the policy, as we're thinking about where we've come from and how we've handled certain problems and certain issues. Coming together along those lines makes a huge difference. And again, I'm just delighted we're able to successfully do that here in Washington. And my hope, David, is that we can find greater opportunities to duplicate that on the local and state level as well.
No, I think that's another important aspect of how can JACL and NAACP work together is at that local chapter level, because we do both have such an extensive network of our local chapters and everything. To sort of go along with this question about coalitions, there's a question about the rise, particularly with Black Lives Matters. I think in the Japanese American community, we have groups like Sudo for Solidarity, which are sort of more youthful grassroots organizing. How can more established, and how do we, as more established legacy civil rights organizations like NAACP and JACL, who have been around for 90, 110 years, relate to these new movements and the new movement leaders as well?
You know, I think for starters, we kind of see ourselves in them. You know, although our organizations have been able to stay around long enough and been working hard enough to continue to work to address issues and concerns of our communities, there was a time when we were the young up and comings, so to speak. We were the ones that were doing things that they didn't think we were supposed to do. Look, I'm reminded oftentimes that even as the NAACP had been around for a few years, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had not. And as such, one of the strategies that was utilized for these young people to be able to participate in, for instance, those lunch counter sit-ins that we see so often as we celebrate our movements across this country. But one of the things that helped that work was that, as the story was told to me, at that time, mostly the daddies were running the NAACP. Our children, as they were in college and otherwise, becoming actively involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They became kind of the youth arm of SNCC, of SCLC. And as the kids would go in and sit in on the lunch counter, after all the mess was made and all the taunting and torturing of them was done in that particular lunchroom, they were arrested and taken to jail. And the daddies had told them in that old school way that if you go to jail, you're going to stay there. Now, my daddy's told me that about things as well. I don't know how much he meant. I just trusted him on his word and didn't go. But nonetheless, when think about it in those terms, that's how they approached it. But the mamas told the daddies, those are my babies. And they're fighting for a future for themselves and for our country. They're putting their lives on the line to actually bring about the change that the law has already said is supposed to happen. But the realities of enforcement here, wherever we happen to live, hasn't. So they're testing, they're challenging, and they're moving to make those changes. It really took that involvement and the mamas turning to the daddies and saying, look, if you don't get my baby out of jail right now, you'll see what life's going to be like for you this evening from that point on until my baby comes home. So sometimes the struggle was there and whatnot, but we recognized the need to do it. And I think that looking back on that and even looking at what's happening now with the young organizations that are coming up and taking it on in their youthful culture, we have to support them. You know, the NAACP, I think, did something that I was so proud of. Right after Black Lives Matter had gone through the Ferguson, Missouri awful case and whatnot, of course, Michael Brown was killed by Darren Walker, 6'4" tall police officer, killed Michael Brown in a little suburb of St. Louis called Ferguson, Missouri. When he killed him, it was very clear that a number of things are also coming out in that case that we needed to lift up. One of those was Michael Brown was clearly unarmed. He was coming from a convenience store with a little something to drink, and not even talk about alcohol, and a few other things with him as well. Police officer pulls him to the side in a very suburban community, not even sidewalks, but a very nice suburban community nonetheless. Before it was all over, that 6'4" tall police officer, armed with a shotgun inside of his car, on one side of his belt, a taser, on the other side of his belt, it's a service Glock. He goes in to talk to this kid who was scheduled to start college the very next week, by the way. He was 18 years old, just graduated from high school, scheduled to start the University of Missouri the very next week. And the police officer then begins talking about it. One of the things that I learned from that particular part of it as we move towards coalition and the younger people being involved is that Michael Brown was just like any other kid. He was not considered to be extremely brilliant in any way. He was just a normal kid, a normal 18-year-old that was ready to start college, that had already registered and was prepared for school to begin. And when I read the transcripts from the grand jury hearing, I think I'm some kind of wonk that way, but you really should take a look at how this police officer described his feelings about Michael Brown before he shot him to death. When he talked about how when he looked into Michael Brown's eyes, what he saw he did not think was human. When he looked at Michael Brown and watched him, he was fearful for his life, thought about him more as being like a shark or something else that's, again, not human. And then he felt the only way he could protect himself was by using his gun against someone who was unarmed, someone who was 18 years old, someone that had a future ahead of them and was thinking about how great things were going to be when he started college that next week. And when he began talking about those issues, she began to wonder, how could anyone not see that this police officer was not treating Michael Brown as a human being? He was treating him as some kind of animal in which he had to fear for his life. But again, Darren Walker was 6'4". Darren Walker had guns, tasers, nightsticks. He had a shotgun in his car that he could reach for. Because keep in mind, he was in his car when he summoned Brown over. And then Brown started running away from him. So the police officer pushed himself out of the car, pulled out his gun and started shooting him. Let me just say details that are not pleasant, but sometimes we have to know the details as well. I've studied and I've gone to both the FBI and some of the other local law enforcement agencies in DC to talk about how things are done. That is, what are police officers taught to do when they feel like they need to pull out their gun and use them? And the police officers and the FBI all told me the same thing. They said, we're taught to shoot for mass. That is, we're taught to shoot for the body along these lines. As a matter of fact, David, it's kind of a funny story. When I was going through my FATS training, is the acronym for this kind of digitized, they take a real gun and change it to keep the same weight, but so that it shoots a laser, you can see where it hits on the target and you can play through these scenarios. Well, I decided that if I had to shoot somebody going through that scenario, I was going to go for limbs, shoulders, arms, legs, thighs, that kind of thing and whatnot. And actually, it turned out I was a pretty good shot using that, that program and whatnot. But the fascinating thing for me is that afterwards, they told me I failed. And as I looked at the charts, I saw that I hit him in each limb at least once, in many cases more than once. But I didn't shoot anything here or around the body. But they said, but you still failed the test, Hilary. You failed the test because you were supposed to shoot for mass. Let me take this back to Darren Walker for just a minute. He was taught to shoot for mass as well, but he shot Michael Brown in the face at least once and in other parts of his body as well. In other words, whatever was controlling him under those circumstances are things that anyone that we have working in law enforcement should not have. We know that he was a bad choice when they hired him. We know that he made some other mistakes that just didn't seem to get raised to the same level of seriousness or attention as what he did to Michael Brown. But we know they shouldn't have been. That's why they had to ask him to leave anyway. Even as we watched the prosecuting attorney and the grand jury actually muddle things as they did, no charges were ever brought against Officer Walker. So with all that in mind, we know we're going to have to work together for some of those changes, because I'm convinced that those same hate mongers, whether they're able to don a police uniform or happen to find their way into our communities, they're going to go after us, whether we're Black, white, Asian American, Native American, or other differences in our society. They're going to go after us if you're poor and white as well, as we're finding out. But they're going to go after people of color a whole lot faster. So setting in place policies we know that will help, change how police officers are trained, change what they're going to be held accountable to, and change whether or not they can continue to serve as police officers, given that extraordinary level of power, if they don't actually adhere to the serve and protect logo on the side of their police cars.
Now, we're a little bit over an hour and a half now. Do you have time for one more question?
I'd be delighted.
Okay. So this actually goes back to some of our conversation about how communities are oftentimes pitted against one another, that there are often differences between our communities, and those are sometimes leveraged, I think. And it actually becomes ingrained in our own communities as well, where we actually do see anti-Blackness within the Asian American community, and we do see anti-Asian discrimination from the African American community. What can we be doing to try and combat that, to make sure that our communities are not buying into this paradigm of fighting against one another and recognizing what the real threats are?
I think that the key to that really is in getting to know each other a lot better. Celebrating each other where we celebrate. Celebrating traditions of the Asian American community and traditions of the African American community. Also, it means that exchanging other things that are important as well. And one of the things I'm proud of my church here in Washington, which is a predominantly African American United Church of Christ facility, is that they're very deliberate about us celebrating and sharing with a diversity of communities by going over to other houses of worship, whether it be churches, temples, mosques, whatever the deal might be, and then them coming over and celebrating in our communities. When we go over to their communities to celebrate, we'll probably end up eating some foods, tradition, that are a big part of their tradition. Something that you can see, I can find some way to lay off, but I'm having too much fun doing it. But being able to share foods, share culture, that is music, dance, other things that really make us what we are and how we show what we are when we're celebrating, are even when we're going through other of life's changes and whatnot. I think it starts there. I think in addition to that, when problems occur, that means that we in our leadership roles can reach out to each other. When my friends, as an example, in the Jewish community, when someone would attack one of their temples, indeed, the NAACP president will stand next to the rabbi as we say this is unacceptable, as we say together that these are communities that we all know and love, and we want to find out who did this and make sure this never happens again. Because we recognize, as we've seen in so many hate crimes, they'll go after one community and then drive across the border to go after another. Still remember one hate monger shooting Ricky Birdsong, who was a college basketball coach. But then they shot an Asian American postal worker as he worked to deliver the mail. They shot up a Jewish temple because they knew that they were also holding a facility, a program for young people in that particular facility. So they shot in that direction and other directions as well. In essence, we know that sadly, one of the things that we share in common is an enemy that doesn't like us simply because we may look a little bit different. Even if we call ourselves celebrating the same God, we'll still run into those kind of problems. So again, working together along those lines to really know each other better, to celebrate life with each other, community with each other, if I might, but then move in the direction of making sure we recognize that not only is it feeling good and loving each other and having a great time celebrating with each other, it means we're going to have to work together to make sure our communities become everything we need them to be. A safe, secure place to raise our families, which is also amazing, David, when you think about it. Regardless of what someone looks like, and even those that fall to the Klan and other hate groups, if you ask them what they really want for their families, you'll just see just how similar it is. Mm-hmm. Kids to get an education as far as their minds will take them, give them greater opportunity. They want them to have access to the economic life in our country. We're living in a capitalist society. It's required. And making sure they have also an opportunity to live in a safe, secure community, to count on that police officer to watch over them and their property and their loved ones, to make sure that the fire department can come out if some problem occurs along those lines, and to make sure that, again, equal opportunity means just that. I don't care what you look like or what your accent is, but what we care about is that you care about this community as well, that you share those common values, that you're ready to work together and we want to work with you. Matter of fact, quite frankly, I think I would get rather bored if we all looked too much alike. I would get rather bored. I would get rather bored if our food tasted too much alike. I could rather boards that were talking about funny stories, they all happen to have the same punchline. You know, I think that diversity is something that we love. Those differences are something that we celebrate. We're able to see, just as we have fun talking about those differences, really just how similar we are in the things that are most important about being human beings on planet Earth.
I think that's a perfect way to end this. I really appreciate you taking the time today, Hilary. And I know as we were even preparing for this, and we knew that this wasn't going to be enough time to cover everything we wanted to. Perhaps we can do this again, maybe even bring in some other of our coalition partners or something. But I think we've just scratched the surface tonight, and there is just so much to talk about. But really appreciate you taking the time tonight. And I know we've kept you a little longer than we had planned to, but really appreciate it.
Well, David, look, the only thing was missing is some of that good food I get when I come to a JACL convention conference.
We're missing that too. Hopefully we can get this COVID thing taken care of. We can get back to having events on both sides and inviting one another to come over.
Oh, brother, I'm going to hold you to that. We're going to have a great time. In the meantime, thank you again for being everything JACL is and carrying that rich tradition forward. And thank you for working in coalition with us. We're looking forward to all the, as John Lewis would say, the good trouble that we're going to commit together.
And yes, and certainly want to remember him tonight as well. Thank you so much, Hilary. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.